Good afternoon, everybody. And we start again now in a session called Paying for Truth. And paying for truth is a term which can have many kinds of interpretations. And what we will try and discuss today with Helga Nowotny and Bo Rothstein is what those different interpretations are and what it means to us in different spheres. Helga is the former head of the European Research Council. She was one of the founding members of the council and then headed it. That's transformed research all over Europe. And Bo Rothstein is now from our very own Gothenburg here. He was recently at Oxford University, and he deals with very important questions of ethics and society and how we make decisions about those kinds of matters. So from science and society, we have views on what paying for truth means. Now, paying for truth could mean three things. How do we build institutions? How do we pay for them where truth and all kinds of ideas can be discussed? Secondly, paying for truth means that if you speak the truth, you could be paying for it, you could be in trouble. How does one deal with those kinds of situations? And thirdly, you could pay to create your own version of the truth. So let's find out what our panelists think about these three versions of paying for the truth. So first of all, Helga, how do we build institutions where truth can be discussed safely and with multiple ideas coming forth?
Well, we have started some 400 years ago, or some people say even longer, when the first universities came about in the 12th and 13th century. But since modern science, we have also universities or other places where, in a systematic way, we explore first the natural world and then later on also the social world or ourselves. So we have these institutions, we call them scientific institutions, universities, research institutions, etc. Now, what is peculiar is if you go to any lab or to any university, you will not find many people, apart from the philosophy department, where people actually discuss truth. If you go to a lab, what people are discussing all the time is, does it work or does it not work? You set up an experiment and you are interested, does it work? So, of course, there is something underneath it, because you are not just setting things up in a random way. You need years of training to know what you are doing. You need years of also training in terms of a discipline or more than one discipline, etc., to have this kind of knowledge and the skills to produce something. And to come back to your question, who pays for it? Modern societies don't pay for truth by setting up these institutions. They are interested in the technological output. They're interested in the kind of knowledge that comes from these institutions for the sake of human betterment, to make us more healthy, to cure certain diseases, to make progress in the way, even the grand challenges today that we are facing. So we turn to these institutions to look for solutions to the problems we have. But we are not paying them in order to produce truth. And yet, truth is important. And for science, I would say truth is not really something that you can negotiate. Science is essential, truth is essential for science, first for epistemic reasons. I mean, you need the basis, and you have to get some agreement, testing what you know against reality, validating it. But you also want to have something that improves the way how we live and the way how the world functions. So this is, what we're actually paying for.
But
And the question, of course, is if we're not paying for truth and truth yet is essential, it also binds together the scientific community. Something like fraud in science, it happens. But there's a very strong inbuilt tendency to react very strongly against it, because it is so important to have a common basis and to know, does it work, does it not work.
So, in many ways, society creates institutions to solve its problems. Truth is essential for this problem solving, but society sometimes or many times doesn't explicitly pay for
That's right.
truth seeking institutions. There, the humanities and social sciences play a critical role. You pointed out very nicely how scientists are caught up in their work of the day, following the scientific method, as it were, and doing things honestly. But sometimes this can allow them to miss bigger things which are happening around them, or new ideas which are coming from other areas. So, do you think there's a room in institutions where we pay for the truth, for humanities and sciences and the social sciences to come together in some kind of a meeting place where ideas mix regularly?
Yeah, I think so. And I think the central notion of this is the idea of impartiality or neutrality. You're not supposed, if you work in science, to sort of further any ideological or religious or economic interests. There are sort of areas where disinterestedness or impartiality is the central thing. And I think the humanities and the social sciences are extremely important for understanding this notion of impartiality. I mean, if you would summarize human suffering in the world today, I can assure you it has very little to do that we have not invented new technological devices or new medicines. I would say that most human suffering in this world is caused by that about 70-75% of the human population live under incompetent, dysfunctional, or corrupt government institutions. So there is a very clear sort of notion between the social sciences and humanities understanding why this is so and what can be done to change it, and the natural sciences.
So I'll come back to this very important point about how human problems and suffering can be solved by communicating the truth to leaders and so on. But let's segue into the next point, the next question, which is, what are the consequences of stating what you believe to be the truth in a blunt manner? Um, do you deal with that in a nuanced way? Are you supposed to be very careful about what the consequences are? Or do you say what you want to say irrespective of what the consequences are? Do you deal with it in a manner which rocks the institution which you work in? Or do you let certain things be?
It was a legendary political scientist, Aaron Wildavsky, who said that what our job is to speak truth to power. Now, I can assure you, you do not always get very popular. There is one specific problem. Sometimes the truth that you discover points in a direction that you normatively don't agree with yourself.
Yeah, yeah.
So, for example, I would love for democracy to be a functioning cure against corruption. It is not. And that is, of course, a problem for myself. I'm a big fan of democracy, but that is not the major cure for this problem that we see. So that can create problems, of course. And then there are, of course, sometimes everyone runs in the same direction. All of your friends, all of your colleagues, the whole society gets a kind of moral panic and they run there. And you feel you are the only one standing and looking at it and say, this is all wrong. Take Sebastian Haffner's book about, he was a German journalist who grew up in Germany. And his book is published in 1939, so before anyone knew. And he describes how everyone, all his friends, all his colleagues went with the Nazi party. He was at last the last man standing there. And you can discover that if you do science yourself. Everyone is going in one direction and you just shake your head and say, this is not okay.
But Helga,
Yeah.
in these kinds of situations, in today's world, in Europe or elsewhere in the West, in America, scientists often have views about, what kind of power supply we should have, nuclear or solar or whatever, whether we should have GM crops or not, whether vaccines work or not, and speaking these truths in a context where you're employed or your rules are set by someone else can have consequences. How do you deal with this in your day job as a scientist?
Let me give you a personal example. I was professor at ETH Zurich, and one of my colleagues was Mr. Potikas, who developed the golden rice. Now, this is a genetically
Sure.
modified rice species, rice corn, that he invented, and he was attacked. He was attacked by Greenpeace, he was attacked by others. He had enormous problems because he discovered in order to get it patented, he needed something like 50 patents, and in the end, he gave up. He wanted to plant the crop in a field. This was not allowed, and when it was allowed, he was attacked, etc. So he really felt being attacked from all sides. And then I happened to get the chance to get an exhibition space in a museum in Zurich. They had planned for another exhibition, and for 2 weeks they had rooms free of charge. And I said, why don't we do an exhibition on golden rice? And we had very little money. So what I did was I got white cloth and I got students to tell the story of the golden rice by making drawings. And then I asked the students, because just by showing drawings on a floor, you will not get many crowds. So I asked the students, why don't you, like in the Middle Ages, tell the story? So we organized groups of 20 visitors. They had to sign up. And then the students told the story. And this became an immense success. And there were parents who worked in the chemical industry in Switzerland. And they said, finally I can come with my children, and my children can hear from others something, why am I attacked, etc. So what I mean is, you need sometimes intermediators. You need storytelling at times. We all, humans are storytelling animals from the very beginning. And by telling stories, you can convey in a space that is protected, because it's not a university, it was a museum. At the same time, you had students, the story was the correct scientific story, of what happened, but you put it also into a context. And so this was one thing I was able to do. And I think sometimes, we have the possibility of coming up with solutions to mediate and to tell stories. And it's the context that very often is missing.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, that this is a very nice example of a meeting place of different kinds of views, different ideas, so that people can understand each other and at least appreciate each other's views, if not move towards a consensus opinion. But that's what the university is supposed to be about. We shouldn't be in our echo chambers. We're supposed to listen to other viewpoints and then, have the opportunity thereby to change our views. Is that how our institutions are now, or are they become, echo chambers or preventing contrary viewpoints from being discussed? Both?
I think we have a disease from within. Yeah, you can call it academic tribalism. That most academics like to speak to people who think like themselves. They want to create small tribes with like-minded people. And I can say one thing for sure, that one absolute guarantee of becoming stupid is only to talk to people who think like yourself. But unfortunately, there is much within universities that cater to this. So you allow people to isolate themselves in academic tribes instead of forcing people to enter into the discussion with people who disagree with them. And my personal experience, I have sometimes been critical of my colleagues in other disciplines, is the standard reaction should be then that you are invited to have a dialogue. That is how my department act. And people who are invited get very surprised, you know. I'm a critic of you. Why do you invite me? I said, well, we're paid by the taxpayers to have a civilized discussion, at least trying to find out why we disagree. But this is not the universal mode of operation. Instead, you are sometimes ostracized if you criticize.
But I think, you have to break these patterns really. And not all universities are like this. We also have some interesting spaces called Institutes of Advanced Study, both outside universities. The most famous one is Princeton, which was, by the way, based on Abraham Flexner's very interesting manifesto in 1939,
Yeah, yeah,
The Usefulness of Useless Knowledge.
yeah.
And it became the haven for Jewish and other refugees from Europe who had to flee Europe. Einstein was there, von Neumann was there, many others were there. So, and then after the war in Europe, we had Berlin, we had other institutes of advanced study. And now there is a tendency to set up institutes of advanced study within universities, because we need a space for people to meet, not just your own tribe. And if you come with an open mind, you can learn a lot. And therefore, we also have to take a proactive role in setting up these spaces and making them work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think
I'm afraid I have been to 4 such places. 2 have been very good, 2 not so good. But I'm a little afraid, you're supposed to leave your city, your home for a semester or a year to be there. I think these institutions are built on an idea of yesterday, namely that you can bring your partner freely with you without any problems. They are built on the idea that leading scholars are either unhappily married or single, and that is not so much the case anymore. So I think they can be problematic because they attract a very special type of scholars. But in general, I agree, we should have more. But you can have this within universities also.
Yeah. I think within universities, as Helga is saying, it allows different departments, people to meet. I remember a friend of mine telling me that he had a philosopher on a biology PhD thesis committee, and the philosopher refused to shake hands with biologists because they could be infectious, and therefore did this instead of shaking hands. So better communication between philosophers and biologists would be useful. But let's move on to the last aspect, which is paying for truth. And I'd like to hear from both of you in the context of the most critical problem facing this planet, which is climate change, and its consequences, and mitigating that requires us to do things soon, yet paying for truth, that is, paying for your version of truth to be put out, is a serious problem in this context. So Helga, as a scientist and science administrator.
Let me rephrase your question slightly. I think the question really is, why is society not willing to value truth? I mean, you pay for something that you consider valuable. So the value of truth in society has gone down. And you see this in many ways that I don't have to detail. And I think it's worthwhile to consider the reasons why are people not valuing truth anymore. I think one reason has to do with the shifting ratio between signal and noise. This, by the way, is noise. And if the signal is drowned in noise, you become indifferent. You start not to see the value anymore because it's drowned in noise. Another reason is, going back to tribalism, living in a fragmented society where people tend to listen to those that confirm your own views. So then there's your truth and my truth. So why should I be interested in your truth if I have my truth and I get confirmation from my friends and my friends in the cyberspace all the time. So I think these are important changes in society. And to get back, to make people realize again, truth matters. And truth has a value. I think this is a big challenge. And coming back to climate change, there are, of course, these enormous gaps between what people see happening at the micro level and then this immense complexity that we are unable to understand. But again, I think, by bringing, by using simulation models, by visualizing what is going to happen, and these are not scaremongering visuals, but just telling people, if you continue to do this, this is likely to happen. And you explain it in an impartial way, you explain it patiently, but you have to also tell stories and use visual means.
Yeah, on that note, Bo, I mean, something like climate change, we are used to, because of a mindset from the Industrial Revolution, to thinking no matter what we do to the planet, it will set itself back to an okay state. But what we have done in the recent past is dramatically different, and the consequences are going to be immense. Is there room, while others pay for truths of a kind that the planet is resilient to whatever abuse we give it, is there room for science and social media and better communication, as Helga put it, to overthrow the big powers for the status quo?
Yes, I think so. And people, our research show that people are willing, even if they would have to pay quite substantial cost, to do things that are not detrimental to the planet, for example. But only if something can convince them that most other, not everyone, but most other people are also willing to do this.
Yeah, yeah.
And this is, of course, a social dilemma problem. I mean, it's, to make it simple, you're willing to sort your garbage, but it's meaningless if you're the only one in the neighborhood, right? And on the global scale, it is the same. So we have to come up with institutions and new ideas that can convince people that if they are contributing, most other people will also be contributing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But we have a problem here with paying with truth, and that is, especially in the social science and in economics, we see fewer and fewer leading academic scholars, at least in the area that I can see, are participating in this discussion. And more hired guns, people who work for interest organizations or think tanks or special institutes financed by who know whom. And we see an imbalance here between the leading scholars taking part in the public debate and these hired guns. And the hired guns are taking over, and that is not good.
So this is a very important point. If one has to have debates which can sway public opinion into doing things about critically important points for the planet, then the narrative should be set by people in those institutions we create and not by those who, as you call, are hired guns. And that's an enormous challenge which we have today. But to end, I'd like to ask one last point to each of you, 30 seconds each, is what are the chances of success with these kinds of problems there? What is the way by which people at large can see others sorting their garbage and be involved in sorting their own and also paying for the truth to be told? Helga?
Look, we have been speaking about the tragedy of the commons since 40 years.
Yeah.
And the tragedy of the commons is real. And people will start to realize the day it really hits you and your cow in the commons. And then the free rider problem, which Bo mentioned, will solve itself.
Yeah. Bo?
Yeah, I mean, we succeeded in overcoming the Catholic Church. We succeeded overcoming Stalinism, Nazism. Maybe we will succeed in overcoming Trumpism also. That is, of course, the big challenge, yes.
Well, on that happy note, thank you all very, very much for a very wonderful discussion.
Thank you.